Was a medieval child's life a slow, agonizing march toward death? Did a housewife's greatest fear involve a flickering candle and a house ablaze? And what if the very act of caring for your family, feeding them, protecting them, was a perilous dance with disaster? Let's start with Matilda. Not a queen, not a noblewoman, just Matilda, wife of Robert, a miller in Yorkshire. Tuesday, April 24, 1322, midnight. The air thick with the scent of damp straw and wood smoke. Robert and Matilda, their sons William and John, all asleep. A single candle held aloft by Matilda, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of their solar. Then, a careless tilt, a stumble, a spark, and suddenly the whole house roared with flame. Robert and William trapped in the inferno, their skin blistering, screaming. Matilda and John scrambling for escape, barely making it out alive. A tragedy born of a simple, forgotten task, blowing out a candle. It's a chilling image, isn't it? But it's not an isolated incident. Across the English countryside, in villages and hamlets clinging to the edges of the land, similar stories unfolded, etched in the grim records of manorial courts and coroners' inquests. The lives of medieval children, particularly, were a constant negotiation with risk. They weren't shielded, not really. They were thrown headfirst into the realities of survival, often with devastating consequences. Imagine a 2-year-old girl, Alara, mimicking her mother as she stirred a pot of boiling water. A simple act of imitation, a desire to help, and suddenly, scalding liquid spills over, engulfing her tiny body. A gruesome statistic emerges from the records. 17.2% of accidental deaths for girls aged 2 and 3 involved pots and hot water. It's a horrifyingly precise reflection of a brutal reality. Then there's young Thomas, a 3-year-old boy, captivated by his father's work at the mill. He follows, eager to learn, to be part of the family trade. But the mill is a dangerous place, a whirlwind of spinning wheels and heavy machinery. A stray axe blade, carelessly discarded, finds its way into his path. He's struck instantly, tragically. Another 7% of accidental deaths for boys that age, a chilling testament to the precariousness of childhood. It wasn't just the grand, dramatic disasters that defined a child's existence. It was the accumulation of small, everyday perils. A 6-year-old boy named William, tasked with gathering reeds from a marsh, slips on the muddy ground and drowns. A 7-year-old sent to fetch peat from the forest is crushed beneath a falling turf. These aren't tales of heroic sacrifice, they're reminders of a world where a simple errand could become a fatal mistake. But let's shift our focus to the girls. They too were entangled in a web of potential hazards. Fetching water, a seemingly mundane task, accounted for a staggering 32% of accidental deaths for girls aged 6 to 12. A misplaced step, a slippery stone, a sudden plunge into a cold, dark stream, and a life was lost. Cooking, laundry, and tending to the household fires, all activities that demanded attention and skill, yet carried inherent risks. A carelessly handled flame, a forgotten pot, and a child could be consumed by the very things she was meant to care for. And then there were the boys tasked with herding livestock. A flock of geese, startled by a boy's reckless movements, stampedes, dragging him into a river. A young lad attempting to drive sheep to pasture, loses control, sending them careening down a hillside, and he's thrown to his death. The records are filled with similar accounts, boys falling from horses, drowning in streams, succumbing to the cold in winter. It's easy to dismiss these deaths as unfortunate accidents, isolated incidents in a distant past. But the sheer volume of them, the relentless stream of young lives extinguished, paints a different picture, a picture of a society that placed little value on the lives of its children. Now, let's consider Isabel of Abindum. A young woman, not a noblewoman, but a servant of the abbess. She wasn't seeking riches or power, just a few pounds of wool. She crept into the fields of the abbey, pilfering 3 pounds of the precious fleece from 4 sheep. A petty theft perhaps, but one that drew the ire of the abbess and her shepherd. The confrontation was brief, violent. The shepherd, in self-defense, struck her legs with his staff. But Isabel, terrified, refused food and drink, succumbing to starvation. A tragic end not for a grand crime, but for a desperate act of survival. This wasn't an isolated case. Across the land, women were accused of stealing sheep and poultry, clipping sheep in forbidden pastures, and even bleeding a cow for blood sausage. These weren't acts of malice, but of necessity. Famine was a constant threat in the 14th century, and families struggled to feed themselves. Women, often excluded from the formal economy, turned to theft as a means of supplementing their meager income. Interestingly, women tended to steal smaller items, poultry, household goods, while men focused on larger livestock. During the period of severe famine, the number of women indicted for crimes soared, reaching 12%, only to drop back to 9% after the hardship subsided. It was a desperate measure, a reflection of a society on the brink of collapse, but let's not romanticize these actions. Theft was a crime and punishment was harsh. Isabel's fate, starvation, and death is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of the poor and marginalized. Now, let's talk about the women of the house. Matilda, the wife of Robert the miller, her life wasn't one of leisure and luxury. It was a relentless cycle of labor, punctuated by moments of unexpected tragedy. The candle, the fire, the near-death experience, these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem, a lack of safety, a lack of foresight. The records show that women were responsible for nearly every aspect of household management, food production, childcare, cleaning, and repairs. They were the keepers of the hearth, the guardians of the home. But their work was often invisible, unacknowledged, and undervalued. Consider Joan, wife of Hugh Forrester. She demanded the right to inherit a portion of her husband's land, a right that he initially refused to grant her, fearing her disapproval. She fought for her claim, and ultimately she won. It's a small victory, but it highlights a fundamental imbalance of power. Women had legal rights, but they were often ignored or overridden by their husbands. The wills of the men offer a surprising counterpoint to this narrative. They entrusted their wives with significant responsibilities, rewarding them generously for their contributions. Most men named their wives as executors of their estates, demonstrating a level of trust and respect. They left specific instructions, relying on their wives to manage their affairs, choose professions for their sons, and care for their children. One Yorkshire father went to extraordinary lengths in his will, expressing his gratitude for his wife's devotion and promising to reward her for her efforts. He directed her to favor in bringing up her children and to reward them after her power. It's a touching testament to the value he placed on her work, a value that he rarely expressed during his lifetime, but the wills don't tell the whole story. They don't reveal the daily struggles, the unspoken resentments, the power dynamics that shaped the lives of women in medieval society. The moralists of the time, writing about how the good wife taught her daughter, subtly reinforced the idea that women should not gad about the town or get drunk on the money they made from selling cloth. It was a way of controlling women's earnings, of limiting their autonomy. The law, too, protected women's rights to their dowry and inherited lands, but only to a limited extent. A husband could legally disinherit his wife, leaving her vulnerable and destitute. Joan, wife of Hugh Forrester, experienced this firsthand, forced to fight for her inheritance because her husband had failed to consult her. The evidence suggests a complex and often contradictory picture of the medieval marital economy. While some husbands were tyrannical, demanding absolute obedience, many others recognized the value of their wives' contributions. Economic decisions were often joint, with both partners sharing responsibility for the well-being of the household. But the division of labor was still largely determined by gender, with women primarily responsible for domestic production and childcare. Now let's delve into the lives of children and servants. They weren't simply passive recipients of their parents' labor, they were active participants in the family economy. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household's survival, performing chores, gathering food, and assisting with various tasks. The coroner's inquests provide a detailed, albeit grim, picture of children's work and accidents. Young children, even infants and toddlers, were involved in household tasks, mimicking their parents and learning the skills they would need to survive. As they grew older, they took on more demanding responsibilities, fetching water, tending to animals, and assisting with the harvest. Boys in particular were expected to herd livestock, a task that often led to fatal accidents. They were thrown from horses, drowned in streams, and crushed by falling objects. Girls, meanwhile, were responsible for tasks such as cooking, laundry, and childcare. They also contributed to the family's income by selling goods at market. Interestingly, children and servants were often treated as extensions of the family, rather than as separate individuals. The poll taxes of the late 14th century sometimes listed individuals as daughter or son and servant, blurring the lines between family members and hired workers. The Italian Observer, writing in the early modern period, described English attitudes toward children as want of affection, noting that children were often sent out to work at a young age. However, this observation is misleading. The conditions of medieval agriculture were so demanding that children were often required to work from a very young age. It wasn't a matter of indifference, it was a matter of survival. Consider the case of young William, son of Nicholas Bally. He was collecting cockles on the coast when a wave swept him out to sea. Or the 5-year-old boy who drowned while searching for eels in a river. These deaths weren't random, they were the result of a system that demanded constant labor and offered little protection to its youngest members. The peasant family economy was built on the contributions of both sexes, with their separate skills and their separate domains. Women provided the initial goods and capital of their dowry, while their labor and supplemental economic activities helped sustain the household. Marriage was an economic partnership with the goal of both partners being the survival and prosperity of the household unit, but who wore the breeches? Was economic decision-making a joint effort, or did the husband take the lead? The evidence suggests that it was a complex mix of both. Husbands often made the major decisions: land transactions, investments, and inheritance, but they frequently relied on their wives' judgment and expertise. The mutual dependence of a couple on each other's economic contribution encouraged remarriage if one partner died and discouraged intrafamilial violence and homicide. So, as we stand here contemplating the lives of these forgotten people, the question remains, what do we truly know? We have unearthed fragments of information: wills, court records, coroners' inquests, but they paint only a partial picture. The lives of medieval peasants were shaped by a complex interplay of factors: poverty, famine, disease, and social inequality. And as we end this exploration, let's return to the initial question: was a medieval child's life a slow, agonizing march toward death? The evidence suggests it was a precarious dance, a constant negotiation with risk, a relentless struggle for survival. It's a sobering reminder of the harsh realities of the past and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But one final, unsettling question lingers: if we could somehow step back in time, would we choose to live in that world?